This is a presentation of writing systems, a brief history. The earliest examples of writing date back to some 4,000 years before the Common Era. What did these ancients need when they created these writing systems? As the Chinese proverb says, the palest ink is better than the best memory. The very earliest records were found in the Middle Eastern area, comprising modern-day Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They were clay tablets, which had been fired or hardened so that they survived. Most of these early tablets recorded business transactions, such as how many jars of olive oil and how much grain. As time passed, we find more governmental type records, such as laws and regulations and declarations by kings. Notice that it is not very far at all to Egypt. Presumably, the use of such a writing system spread to Egypt very early, and we find a system of hieroglyphs being used in 3500 before the Common Era. But this system did not really represent the spoken language of the time. The earliest symbols were pictures of real objects which gradually simplified to the point that they became quite abstract. Indeed, only trained scribes could create or read them. The Egyptian hieroglyphic system is probably the best example of how these early writing systems worked. They were pictures of real things, such as humans, animals, which at first represented those same objects in the real world. They began also to represent abstract concepts, such as loyalty, death, etc. Such abstract symbols are called word signs because they now had several meanings that had to be memorized and deciphered in part by their context. This led to the need for trained scribes to create and decipher this complicated system. Present-day Chinese also uses a system of word signs called characters that are based on this same principle. Their earliest records date from about 1250 years before the Common Era. And because spoken Chinese uses a predominance of rather short words distinguished by tonal changes, word signs fit the language quite well. And this structure supports the use of word signs. There were many dialects of Chinese in the country at that time. They were thought to be dialects by the Chinese, but in fact, they were actually different languages and were not mutually intelligible. Therefore, a system based on the spoken sounds, such as an alphabet, would have been somewhat confusing. As a result, the Chinese adopted these word signs, which were not based on sound, but had particular meanings and had to be memorized. The benefit, of course, was that these symbols could be read and written by all of the Chinese people. But note that they had to pronounce these symbols using their own dialect or language. Today, college-educated Chinese can read and write about 4,000 individual characters or word signs. Present-day Japanese uses word signs called kanji on the right-hand side of the slide, they were borrowed from the Chinese in the 5th century of the Common Era. But some of these symbols were also modified in the 9th century of the Common Era to represent the syllable sounds in Japanese. And 2 different syllabaries were created and are still in use. Japanese speech is syllable-based, which means that it uses a regular system of consonants and vowels. So syllable, syllable, syllable. Some examples would be Mitsubishi, Sayonara, Toyota. Thus, a writing system which represents syllables fits the structure of the Japanese language very well. Since this system is based on the speech patterns of Japanese, they can be taught the use of a symbol-based system relatively easily. But since they also still use some of the Chinese word signs, they have to be memorized. Today, college-educated Japanese can read and write as many as 2,000 word signs. Consequently, Japanese is one of the more complicated writing systems. As you can see on the chart, watashi wa anime, gai ga sukida. I like anime. And it's a mixture of kanji, word signs, and katakana and hiragana. At the very top is a Romaji or Roman alphabet representation, which is not used very frequently in Japanese. It is important to note that this writing system, though complicated, fits Japanese well and is still used today. As you can see in this slide, it is a mixture of the kanji, the hiragana, and the katakana. Ancient Egyptian was a Semitic language, and so it exhibited a completely different speech pattern from Chinese and Japanese. It used a family of related words characterized by the presence of a 3-consonant root. From this root, words are formed by filling in vowels. For example, the root KTB, meaning to write, gives us the various forms of the word. Kitab, book. Kutub, books. Katib, writer. Kutab, writers. Kataba, he wrote. Yaktubu, he writes. This system is so heavily based on consonants that it was effective to write with just these 3 consonants. And so words were typically written with just 3 consonant symbols, and the reader had to fit in the appropriate vowel based on context. So notice on the chart, the hieroglyph represents an abstract symbol and with the meaning, but it also has a consonant value. In the next phase, we see a text of Egyptian with the transcription underneath. So I watched over the erection of 2 obelisks, great obelisks, at the double door of the God's house in stone of granite. It is important to emphasize that the 3 systems just described dramatically fit the linguistic structure of each language. It is therefore quite understandable that even today, Chinese and Japanese and Arabic writing systems, for the most part, continue to use their original systems. But none of these systems are actually alphabets. Technically speaking, an alphabet is based on the spoken language, and it attempts to represent all of the consonants and vowels, each one individually. The Greeks are then given credit for the one and only invention of an alphabet around 3,000 years ago. They borrowed a writing system from the Phoenicians, who were traders in the Mediterranean. Since the Phoenician system was based on the three consonant system of a Semitic language, it did not fit Greek, which had a balanced system with both vowels and consonants. The Greeks created a system of symbols which added vowels. Indeed, the name of this new system comes from the first two letters of the new alphabet, alpha and beta in Greek. Learning how to read an alphabet is difficult. It is almost always taught in school. First, one must understand the concept of representing spoken speech sounds with arbitrary symbols that the person cannot just look at and understand. Then they have to learn how to split syllables into their consonant and vowel parts, and so on and so on and so on. Strikingly, almost all of the other alphabets in the world are derived from the original Greek alphabet, and most languages in the world use an alphabet. But as Calvin tells us, he likes to verb words. What? I take nouns and adjectives and use them as verbs. Remember when access was a thing? Today it's something you do. It got verbed. Calvin says, verbing weirds language. And the answer is, maybe we can make language eventually a complete impediment to understanding. Showing you language isn't always easy. It is important to note that a single alphabet cannot represent all the dialects of a language. And so consequently, a single dialect is used as the basic choice for the alphabet. Also, alphabets represent the basic sounds of the language called phonemes. A given phoneme has many phonetic details which are ignored in writing. But the fit between the spoken language and its written system using alphabet symbols has been problematic ever since the Greeks. This happens in part because scribes did not always understand the phonemic principle of spelling speech, and so used various symbols or symbol combinations which were confusing to native speakers. And even when they did adhere to the phonemic principle, the spoken languages continued to change over time. This gradually weakened the fit between speech and symbol. But why do languages always change over time? The reason is that all children learning a language must copy it from those around them. And this process of copying anything always introduces small but distinct errors. Slowly but surely, these errors accumulate and cause the language to change. There is a simple thought experiment to illustrate this process. Carefully examine the spoken language used by your parents and grandparents. You will find that you differ in small but noticeable ways from the speech of your grandparents. When this happens over many generations, language change becomes a process which must be accepted as normal and inevitable. Finally, writing systems are conservative by nature. Once people have learned them and they are found to be quite useful, why change? When the Romans borrowed the Greek writing system 2,300 years ago, they had to adapt to fit it to the structure of Latin. 1,500 years later, English speakers had to adapt the Latin alphabet. It should come as no surprise that these successive adaptations created some serious misalignments which increased the burden of learning them. But despite all of the difficulties we have just cited, alphabets have proven to be a very great benefit to humans. They certainly took a complicated path to get there. If you wish more information on any of the above topics, please look in YouTube or Wikipedia.